Many people today may be familiar with the legendary conflict known as Red Cloud's War. This was an armed conflict between the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes and the United States that took place in the Montana and Wyoming territories from 1866 to 1868. In a brief summary, in 1862, gold was discovered in western Montana, which brought hundreds of prospectors and merchants into the region. Most of these newcomers came on the Platte Road, a northern fork of the Oregon Trail, and moved into Montana from the west. But in 1863, two men, John Bozeman and John Jacobs, blazed a new trail from the goldfields to link up with the Platte Road west of Fort Laramie in Wyoming. This new trail cut nearly 400 miles of distance required by other trails to reach the goldfields. But there was a major issue with the Bozeman Trail. It cut directly through the Powder River country, and under the terms of the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, this land had been preserved as Oglala and Brule Lakota, Arapaho, and Cheyenne hunting grounds. Travelers along this new Bozeman Trail faced constant attacks from hostile warriors protecting their lands. No wagon train was safe, and in response, the United States government began building forts along the Bozeman to protect the settlers and miners. These forts would also face frequent attacks. The most infamous battle of Red Cloud's War is the Fetterman Massacre, where Captain William J. Fetterman, who famously boasted, quote, "Give me 80 men and I can ride through the whole Sioux Nation," was led directly into an ambush by a young crazy horse. Hundreds of warriors appeared and 81 Americans were killed, including Fetterman. There were no survivors. The countless raids, skirmishes, and battles of Red Cloud's War are no doubt legendary. But for now, I will be sharing a lesser-known story from Red Cloud's earlier days. The source for today's story is the book The Heart of Everything That Is, by Bob Drury and Tom Clavin. Red Cloud was born in 1822, in what was then Nebraska territory. He was born to an Oglala Lakota mother, walks as she thinks, and a Brule Lakota father, Lone Man. When Red Cloud was only 4 years old, his father died of a whiskey addiction. Red Cloud, his mother, and his little sister then went to live with an Oglala band led by a man named Old Smoke, who was either a brother or cousin to Walks As She Thinks. This band is where Red Cloud would be raised. Red Cloud grew up in a time where the Lakota were dominant on the northern plains, and were in a state of constant warfare with almost all of their neighbors. And it was expected for young Lakota men to frequently go to war against his enemies and commit acts of bravery at every opportunity. In a quote from the book, "A Sioux brave would wager his last breath against the most courageous adversaries, and no matter the outcome, he won. A good death did honor to an entire life." Red Cloud became the embodiment of this warrior ethos, going on his first war party when he was only 16, where he killed a Pawnee warrior. Red Cloud fought against every major enemy of the Lakota as he matured, including the Crow, Shoshone, Pawnee, Blackfoot, Ute, Arikara, and more. On one raiding party into Ute territory in Utah and western Colorado, Red Cloud pulled a drowning Ute warrior out of a river just to stab him to death and then scalp him. On another occasion, while leading a horse-stealing raid on the Crows, Red Cloud and his warriors came across a Blackfoot raiding party who had already stolen horses from the Crows. The Lakota ran them off and were able to capture one Blackfoot warrior alive. Red Cloud told the man if he could endure what came next without making a sound, he would be free to go. Two Lakota warriors held the Blackfoot still. Red Cloud handed his knife to his best friend, a man named Whitehorse, and instructed him to take his scalp. Whitehorse grabbed the Blackfoot warrior's braid and began to scalp him alive, all while Red Cloud waited with his war club raised. Somehow the Blackfoot was able to keep quiet during the torture. Red Cloud was true to his word and told the warrior to return to his village and tell his people that it was the Lakota warrior Red Cloud who had done this to him. Red Cloud was gaining a reputation on the northern plains, and in another quote from the book, "By the time Red Cloud reached his late teens, his fighting qualities, reckless, bravery, stealth, strength, and imperviousness to personal danger, had been established and were merely being honed and perfected. He once single-handedly killed 4 Pawnee in battle, and his ruthless massacres of men and boys, Arikara, Snakes, Gros Ventre, and Crows, were becoming legendary." But even with all his experience, Red Cloud wasn't invincible. The following is an account where things did not go so well for a war party of Lakota led by Red Cloud. The Braves in Red Cloud's camp were growing restless, and it was decided that it had been far too long since they had raided the Arikara, also called the Rees. The Arikara are a northern plains tribe who lived in circular dome-shaped earth lodges, which were permanent dwellings made from wood, grasses, willows, and covered by earth. The Arikara people were hit hard by a smallpox epidemic in the late 18th century, reducing their estimated population of 30,000 down to just 6,000. Red Cloud and 23 Braves rode towards the distant upper Missouri region in search of an Arikara village. They traveled for around 150 miles before they came across a cluster of teepees which they recognized as belonging to the Gros Ventre people. The Gros Ventre being another northern plains tribe who are closely ethnically related to the Arapaho and would later move west into Montana. Although not the chosen target for the raid, the Lakota could not resist the large horse herd the Gros Ventres possessed. They counted the teepees and estimated 30 to 40 warriors for the village, compared to their 24. But the Lakota looked down on the Gros Ventres as inferior warriors compared to themselves, and were confident in attacking. It took Red Cloud and his warriors several hours to creep through a marshy gully until they were behind the Gros Ventre village. Now in position, they charged on foot, shooting their guns and bows as they ran. The Gros Ventre men poured out of their lodges and formed a skirmish line. They were able to withstand the attack and even pushed back the Lakota. The war party regrouped and charged again, even more determined than before. But once again, the Gros Ventre held their ground and hit 4 Lakota Braves with either bullets or arrows. But the war party had been able to cut out around 100 horses from the enemy herd. The Lakota considered this skirmish a victory and headed south. Of the 4 hit warriors, 1 had died and 3 were wounded. After a day of riding, Red Cloud was confident they were not being followed. The party stopped and put their dead comrade in the branches of an elm tree. Red Cloud then split his men, sending 10 men, including the 3 wounded, back to the Oglala lands with their captured horses. The remaining 13 would follow Red Cloud south on the Missouri until they reached the original target, the Arikara. It didn't take them long. The next afternoon they found the Arikara village. They climbed a ridge overlooking the village and began planning their attack. Unlike the majority of Western tribes, the Arikara built corrals to hold their horses during the night. This was the target of the Lakota. The warriors watched as the Rees led their horses into the corral for the night. They waited until midnight, then rode down from the ridge, crouched low in their saddles. The plan was to get close to the village, dismount, smash open the corral, stampede the horses, and make a run for it. The plan was going perfectly. With Red Cloud in the lead, the Lakota rode single file to within arrow shot of the corral. When 2 rows of Arikara appeared from the tall grass on either side of the column and opened fire with rifles and bows, Red Cloud knew immediately the Rees had been alerted to their presence by the Gros Ventre. In the chaos, he and the man behind him lost control of their horses, who bolted straight into the Arikara corral. The 2 men dropped down and tried to mix in with the herd, but with the shooting, several of the horses were stamping and bucking. The last Red Cloud saw of the other man was the brave holding on to the tail of a horse who had broken through the corral and was galloping downriver. The shooting had calmed down, and he could tell that the fight had moved from the river up into the bluffs. This was his chance. He crawled on his belly until he got through the herd. He was now close to the village. Red Cloud pinned his rifle to his leg, threw his blanket over his head, and walked right into the Arikara village. There was no moon, and the only light came from inside of the earth homes. He walked past several people, including armed enemy warriors. One woman even said something to him in Arikara, which he did not understand. He just grunted in response. He eventually reached the river. He was about to jump in and make a swim for it when he remembered the boats. The Arikara were known for their boats they used to navigate the Missouri. They were made of buffalo bull hides stretched over rounded willow frames. Red Cloud rushed down the banks and cut one of these boats loose. He pushed it out and then jumped inside. There was a single paddle inside which he used to propel himself. The shooting had completely stopped and no one had followed him. He traveled the river all night and in the morning steered himself into a small creek on the west side of the river. He tied his boat and went ashore, searching for food. He was able to shoot a prairie chicken off a branch. He plucked off the feathers and ate the bird raw. He was sure all of his friends had been killed. He returned to his boat and slept until nightfall. He pushed back onto the river, and for the next 4 days repeated this process, drifting the river at night and hunting and sleeping during the day. Early on the fourth day, he thought he heard drum beats up the river. He paddled to the bank and moved very slowly. He heard dogs barking. He had discovered a camp. He tied his boat and crept ashore. He crawled to just outside the camp and listened for voices. Eventually he heard them, and to his extreme relief, they were Lakota. He stood and walked into the camp. He was expecting them to be a band of Eastern Lakota, Hunkpapas or Miniconjus, but he was surprised to find they were a band of Brule Lakota, the tribe of his father. The Brules were equally surprised, as Red Cloud was a well-known and respected leader who had just appeared in their camp. He stayed with the Brules for several days, while he told the story of the Gros Ventre fight and Arikara ambush. Eventually, the Brules supplied him with horses and food and sent 2 young warriors to escort him home. 5 days later, he rode into his home village, much to the shock and relief of everyone, especially his wife Pretty Owl. Of the 14 warriors ambushed, Red Cloud was the 7th to return alive. 2 more would follow, although 1 would die of his wounds. The warrior Red Cloud saw hanging from the Arikara horse never returned. Red Cloud had returned with no wounds, and the story of his escape only added to his legend. Red Cloud would go on to be the only Native American chief in history to defeat the United States military in a war. With the Bozeman Trail being officially closed to settlers in 1868, the 3 forts along the trail were abandoned by the Army, and shortly after, they were burned to the ground by Red Cloud's warriors.